Women Executive Director Dr. Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka.
I have the Undersecretary General of the United Nations and the Executive Director of UN Women, Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka. And of course, when you are at the IMF and World Bank spring meetings, a discussion on globalization often happens, a discussion on protectionism often happens, but also a discussion on inclusive growth, what many South Africans are today referring to that as radical economic transformation. And of course, when you talk about poverty, at the bottom of the economic rung, often you find women. So Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka, the Undersecretary General of the United Nations, joins us now. You've just stepped out of a forum where you were discussing the question of closing the gender gap in finance. Tell us what you heard there and tell us what you told them.
Well, to begin with, the funding gap that everybody understands everywhere in the world is unequal pay. The fact that women work as hard as men, and in all countries you still have the 23% gap where women are paid less than men for work of equal value. But then you move further than that, you look at the investments that we make in supporting programs that intervene in support of women and help to address poverty. In most countries, only about 10% of the programs that are approved by cabinets for implementation in order to address the gender gap across the board get funded. For the rest, the women's minister, or the minister for gender, has to go and fundraise. And that is obviously creating a problem rather than giving us a solution. Donor funding that goes towards a women's program, according to OECD, only 5% of the funds that are available are allocated for women. So what we sometimes would say in South Africa, many people who work in the gender space have unfunded mandates. We have this big responsibility to address poverty, to empower women, but the tools are actually not there, and funds are an essential part of what is missing.
So where then are you finding that the bottlenecks exist? I mean, when you look at governments have a large, especially in developing and emerging economies, they have a lot of problems in their economies. Not only the question of gender equality, but issues of poverty, issues of healthcare, issues of education. So how essential is it in the list of priorities, if you will, is it to where do we place the question of women's empowerment?
I think the gender stereotypes that we complain about in the private sector exist in the development world as well, where money and women are seen as opposite, women and wealth are seen as opposite, but women and poverty are seen as bedfellows. And that is where we need to start, to make a case that feminist movements, women's organizations need as much money as the money that you provide when you are supporting some of the mainstream programs and initiatives. I sometimes joke and say when women need a truck, they get given a bicycle to achieve the same purpose. So there's a lot of the stereotyping and the changing of norms about what is essential investment for women that still needs to happen. We also have a very, very important study by McKinsey that shows that if women were to be involved in economic activity in the same way as men, we would be able to increase economic performance of countries by as high as $25 trillion by 2025. Now, you need to do certain things in order to facilitate that progress. And it is the investment that will facilitate that progress that is not happening. And so here we are trying to make that case to ministers of finance and other stakeholders.
One of the cases you've been trying to make for a while, of course, we've just come out of the Commission on the Status of Women, is closing the gender pay gap. Women, of course, earning around 77 cents on every dollar that a man earns. Women can't really afford that bicycle because if they at least earned $1.
That's a robbery. Not to pay women for services rendered is actually a robbery. And the fact that it exists in all countries, and countries that have constitutions that enshrine gender equality, the fact that the rich and the poor, the progressive and the less progressive, all actually have this problem, shows us that this is also a universal phenomena, and we need these international global fora to have this discussion and hopefully to get some traction.
part of the ministers that joined you on the panel in that discussion were from Sweden and Canada, countries that identify themselves as feminist governments. What's a feminist government, and how are they helping to improve the role of women in society?
Well, they rank much better than most countries in most of the indicators that are critical for gender equality. But amongst the challenges that even these countries still face is unequal pay, high violence against women, underrepresentation of women in decision-making bodies, especially in the private sector. And so even though they have come thus far, they still have some way to go, and it's important that they should keep on trying.
Of course, there is a gender goal in the SDGs. A lot needs to be achieved by 2030. We've adopted the SDGs a few years ago. How are you seeing the pace increasing in terms of the goals you've set for yourself?
The consoling thing is that there's a common agenda that most countries identify with. So that helps us to embark on similar activities so that we can create scale. But the biggest problem is the pace of change and the investments. So we need to address that, and my appeal is also to leaders of countries, leaders of corporations. They need to lead from the front, because if you leave this to people who still need to mobilize their colleagues, it actually takes much longer. Someone has to set the tone from the top. In that way, you can actually accelerate the pace of change.
We've also spoken in the past about the need for legislation, and you've often spoken about the fact that a number of countries actually have good laws on their books, but it comes down to implementation, it comes down to enforcement. Have you tried to make progress? Have you seen progress in that regard?
Yes, we have 150 countries that still have legislation that discriminates against women. So the changing of legislation is an important part of our work. Just last year, we helped countries to change or enact 79 laws, but the implementation is another story. So we are therefore also embarking in support of countries to address norms and stereotypes that tend to be stronger than the laws. And sometimes women don't even know that a good law has been passed. And we need the media, people like yourself, to make sure that the women know that a good law has been passed. And we need to support local government, women's organizations, government officials to actually implement these good laws that are being passed.
Always a pleasure to see you. Thanks very much, and enjoy your continued deliberations with the VIPs behind us.
Thank you.
Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka, that's Dr. Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka, is the Executive Director of UN Women and Under Secretary General at the United Nations, talking about closing the gender pay gap and gender access, female access to finance.